Honestly, I haven't a clue what I'm doing. I have tried to write stories in the past. I've never gotten past chapter three, maybe. So this time around, I want to do something a bit different, and I hopefully am going to succeed. I'm hoping this journey is going to be me showing you start to finish how I began my book and finished it. I mean, the dream would be to get it published, but let's keep our dreams achievable at this point and just hope that we can start a book, progress the book, and then finish the book. Hiya, I'm Orla. Thank you for clicking into my video. I'm an aspiring fantasy author with the goal of completing the first draft of my first book by the end of this year. I aim high. I'm nothing if not an attempting overachiever. So recently I began writing a new novel, and for the first time ever, I'm actually making progress on it. I've been writing on and off since I was a small child. I used to tell stories to my sibling, to my classmates when I was in primary school, and then once I got into secondary school, I started writing them down a bit more, but they never really went anywhere. The furthest I've ever gotten was once I completed a whole book, so I've already called myself out as a liar. I wrote a full book once, or a full story, and I believe I was maybe 8, and I had typed it out on my granddad's computer. He had one of those really old Windows computers, and he printed it off for me. I drew up a cover for it and he stapled it together, and I was just so proud of that book. I couldn't tell you what it was about. I couldn't tell you anything about it except that I was really proud of myself, and I was just so happy that I had finished writing a book and created this physical book that you could look at and you could read and you could enjoy. And on reflection, that was probably where the writing bug really got its teeth into me and then didn't let go. There's definitely been periods of my life where I've done a lot less or no writing, and some of those periods are quite long. I'm talking like years. And then there's periods of my life where every single day I can't actually rest until I've sat down and put some words on paper or thought about an idea. Um, so yeah, started writing when I was a small child. I do have a second memory of writing. Oh, I couldn't tell you how old I was. I want to say maybe 10 or 11. I was old enough that um I was able to go around to the corner shop by myself to buy envelopes and stamps. So I wrote I think 3 or 4 pages of a book, and my thinking was I would send off these pages to a publisher, and if it was really, really good, then I'd finish up the book. And yeah, that didn't happen. I think I got maybe 2 rejection letters after sending like 10 little booklets of novels. And the rejection letters I got, I can remember who they were from, but I'm not going to name and shame. But they were really lovely. Like you could tell that whoever was reading them knew it was a small child who hadn't a clue what they were doing. So that they're my two biggest successes in writing to date. I'm now a little bit older than 10. Um so yeah, I mean, having started and stopped writing repeatedly, like all through secondary school, I didn't do much in college. I did a little bit after college. I did a bit during COVID. I think who among us did not pick up an abandoned hobby during COVID? Um, I just spent some time reflecting on why had I never gotten any further than writing a couple of pages or maybe a chapter after so many attempts at trying different genres. Like I've tried crime and thriller, fantasy. Like why was I not getting that much success? Um, I generally gravitate towards fantasy. I love reading fantasy. I have found any stories I've written in the past have all been based around fantasy. So I think that's definitely a preferred genre for me. I'll read anything, but I think in terms of writing, fantasy is definitely my preferred genre. So I don't think it was because I wasn't writing what I was interested in. Um, so why did I never complete a story? Why did I always hit this roadblock? I think I've always put it down to not having enough time to sit and write. Life was too busy, or my story just wasn't good enough and it wasn't holding my interest. Or maybe my writing wasn't good enough, or I was easily distracted. I think I had a laundry list of excuses for why I had all of these failed attempts to write a story. And the reality is, life is busier now. I am an adult with a young family. Um, I have a household that I'm, looking after. I have a full-time job. I get maybe 30 minutes to an hour of free time for myself every day between getting the kids to bed and getting ready for the next day. Um, I'm a huge reader. I absolutely love reading. So a lot of my free moments is taken up reading a book instead of scrolling. Now that was, I just don't want to upset anyone. That was a very conscious decision. I used to spend way too much time doom scrolling, and I just decided instead of doing that, I was going to read, and that was where I started downloading like the Libby app for accessing library books and the Amazon Kindle app, so that when I took out my phone to scroll, I could just jump into a reading app instead. Getting completely off topic, we'll dial it back a bit. The long story short is life is busier now. I'm older. I don't have as much energy. I don't have as much free time. Um, I try to write at night because that's when I tend to be able to, but I'm tired. But despite all of that, I am still managing to write a book. I'm not very far into it at the moment. I'm still early days, but I am consistently putting words on a paper or on a page and progressing the story that I want to tell. Um, so if we take a few steps backwards, how did I get to that point? Um, it started off like all great things. It started off with an idea. I was driving with my husband one night. The kids were asleep in the back of the car, and we just started talking. And I said, I have this idea. And I worked through the idea with him. And he asked me some questions. He asked me like things that I would need to consider in order to have a rich, fulfilling story. Things like, what's the magic system going to look like? What's the political structure of the world going to look like? Things that I hadn't quite considered, and really had never thought about in terms of writing a book. So him asking me those questions sort of sparked in me like, yeah, how do I answer those questions? It's great that I have an idea, but how do I take that idea from my mind and make it into something tangible that I can read and see? My husband was really encouraging of me exploring that. So he helped me work through my feeling of being completely overwhelmed. And we Googled how to write a novel. We started really, really at the basics, how to write a novel. And YouTube threw up the Brandon Sanderson lecture series. So, in case anyone doesn't know, I'll link these in the description box. He has two lecture series that are 5 years apart. One is from 2020 and one is from 2025. And as well as being a highly successful published author, Brandon Sanderson is a lecturer in creative writing in BYU over in the States. And every 5 years, he records his lectures and puts them on YouTube for free. I don't even think they're monetized. So it was just an absolutely fabulous resource for somebody who didn't know where to start. He approaches the lectures as if you already know a little bit about writing, which is perfect because he's teaching creative writing to students who presumably are already writing. But even then, he did it nearly in a step-by-step method, starting off, you put your ideas down and then you do your outline and then you do this and then you do that. And it was the word outline that really, really stuck in my head. From listening to this lecture series, I learned that there's actually two different ways of writing. Primarily two different ways of writing. There's the discovery writing, which is the pantsing, and then there's the planner or the outline writing. And this was mind opening for me. I always just thought that if you were writing, you just sat and you wrote. And in school, whenever we did creative writing for assignments, that was it. You just sat and you wrote, you didn't even edit. And all of a sudden, I was being presented with this process that you could follow. And it made it feel so much more accessible. And it made me feel that I didn't need to have hours and hours to sit and write every day in order to be a writer, that I could actually do it in 20-30 minute slots. So in his lecture series, Brandon Sanderson outlined his process, and my first attempt at following that process didn't work out for me. He has a very specific way of doing his outlines and his story structures, but definitely listening to that lecture series gave me more questions to ask about what I didn't know, because we don't know what we don't know. And a little, as this video is going to prove, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. My hope is to record a series of these videos every couple of weeks to describe the process that I'm following in order to get my novel written, and then to provide updates on how it's going. This one is just going to be discovering my writing process. I'll also do how I outlined the book, and I'll do, a couple of write along with me videos. I'm not quite sure how they're going to manifest, but baby steps. So, all of that rambling to say, I am going to explain what I have learned from all my Googling, all my YouTube watching about discovery writing versus planning. And after doing all of this research and all of this Googling and reading and watching of videos, what I'm finding is working for me as I write my own story. We'll start off with discovery writing. This is often called pantsing, and it comes from the phrase flying by the seat of your pants. It's generally when you start writing, but you don't have a predetermined outline. You just sit down and go with the flow and write whatever comes to your mind. Writers can start off with a general premise, or they might have a character that they want to explore, or they might have a story that they organically draft without thinking too much about what's going to happen and when. There are some famous discovery writers. The two most famous ones are Stephen King and George R.R. Martin. So I just have some quotes from them on their take on discovery writing, which I found really interesting. So Stephen King said, "I take people, put them in a tight situation and see how they wiggle out. I don't really know how it ends until the book is done." And I've also seen other quotes from Stephen King where he's talked about how if he sits and plans a story, as far as he's concerned, that's the story told. And it takes the magic out of it, and it takes the motivation of finishing the story out of it. So for him, sitting down and writing in this discover as you go style seems to work really, really well for him. George R. R. Martin has a slightly different take on it. He said that he says, "I often said that writers are of two types. There are architects and gardeners. The architect designs the entire novel, lays out the entire blueprint, and then there's the gardener who digs a hole in the ground, puts in the seed and waters it, and with his blood, and see what happens." And I didn't get that exactly right. I paraphrased a little bit, but it's essentially the same idea where the architects or the outliners or the planners will come up with the blueprint for the story and use that to write their novel, while gardeners will kind of see what happens as they go. I think George R. R. Martin has a bit more outlining in his stories, but it's still very much discovery writing. Sorry, I have my notes here in front of me so I don't forget what I want to say. So why would authors choose discovery writing over outlining? Um, some of the reasons are organic character arcs. They have characters that behave they believe the characters will behave in a more natural way and have a more natural progression, rather than being forced fit into a rigid structure. So it's a little bit more organic as you learn about the person, learn about their journey through the narrative. There's also creative excitement. So the writing process stays interesting and exciting because the author is just as surprised at what they put on the page than the reader is. They're coming up with plot twists and different dynamics, and they haven't planned it through. So there's a little bit of letting the characters tell them what's going to happen instead of telling the characters what's going to happen. And then sometimes there can be natural foreshadowing. So the subconscious of the author creates these connections in the story naturally, without them feeling forced, without there being some obvious breadcrumbs sprinkled throughout the story, foreshadowing future events. There's a few challenges with this method that are quite common, such as writing into a corner. So without having that roadmap or that outline, sometimes you might get stuck in a dead end with your plot or with your characters, and you have to try and figure out how to get out of that. I mean, I would say having outlined the book, that can happen with outlines anyway. You can have a very clear idea in your head of A and B, but the middle bit of getting there can be a little bit blocked up, unless until you spend a bit more time thinking about it. And often with discovery writing, there's more editing involved because the first draft is really just messy, get the information on the page. So then there would often be substantial editing of that story once it's been written. Some discovery writers do sort of retroactively outlining, so they get their story on the page, and then once they have their first draft done, as they're reading through it and editing it, they'll put a bit more of a structure on it. But essentially, the story is still born from this free flowing, organic discovering process. So, the planning style of writing and outlining is pretty much, as the name suggests, it's a flexible roadmap, and it will organize the plot, the character arc, and any sort of pacing before you start drafting. It's often praised for preventing writer's block and avoiding major plot holes that might get discovered as the drafting process continues. I found this really helpful. After outlining my story, it's really great to have something to refer back to as I'm going to see what's meant to be happening next. I'll go into a little bit more in a few minutes about the approach that I'm taking, but I do find for me it's helpful to have that outline and that structure to keep me on track. That's not to say that I can't deviate from the outline or I don't deviate from the outline. Sometimes as I'm writing, I find that what I had outlined isn't quite working for me the way I want it to work, so I'll just make tweaks as I go. And I think that's why the word flexible is really, really key when they talk about outlining, planning, road mapping, whatever. It's really important that it's flexible and that you're not trying to shoehorn anything into a structure, that you're still allowing a little bit of the creative process to play out as you're actually putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, whatever your medium is. There's loads of different structures that you can use when you're doing planning. The most popular one is the 3-act structure. Um, there's hundreds and hundreds of templates online and different versions of this online. Some people call it the 3 act structure, the 4 act structure. There's the hero's journey. There's Dan Harmon's story circle. I tried most of them. I researched most of them, and I did find that most of the structures I found based around Western storytelling focused where the plot was driven by an external conflict. So this would be, if we think about the hero's journey, we think about it starts because the hero leaves town or a stranger arrives to town or something something, and the hero goes off on their journey and they experience all of these external conflicts, and by the end of the story it's resolved itself and the hero is a changed person based on these external conflicts and how they work through them, um which it seems to be the pretty standard structure for storytelling, both in terms of writing novels and also screenplays. There's a really, oh, I can't remember the name of it now. I'll put up a picture of the book here. But there's a really common screenplay novel about I think it's called Save the Cat. Oh, maybe it is Save the Cat. Um and it walks through all of these different structures. One of the structures that I came across that I really liked was the Kisho Tenketsu structure. So this is in 4 parts and it's really popular in Eastern storytelling. So particularly in China, Japan, and Korea. And where it really differs from Western storytelling is that instead of the plot is being driven by external conflict, it's driven very much by internal conflict. So any of the story progression is happening based on internal reflection of the character. And this really, really appeals to me. I really liked the idea of having this protagonist who was quite introspective, because I'm quite an introspective person, and I think especially as somebody writing for one of the first times, it's quite difficult not to put a little bit of yourself into your characters. But I really liked the idea of having this protagonist who is quite introspective and reflective on different experiences and different relationships that they had. So that really attracted me to the Kisho Tenketsu method. Um, I will probably do a video on that at some point, describing what it is in more detail and breaking down the different parts. So popular outlining methods, there's like a character driven framework where you might start by asking, what does my character need to learn by the end of the story? And you would build scenes that would enable that growth but also test it a little bit. You would be talking more about what does my character want versus what does my character need, and what's going to happen to the character, or what are they going to do to enable that to happen. Um, Another outlining method is just doing a really rough frame. So you don't write down every single detail, but you do outline the protagonist's goal, you outline the inciting incident, so the event that triggers the story to start in earnest. And then you might have 3 or 4 major plot points and then a climax. So it's really a really rough outline, but still a guide nonetheless. And then there's the reverse outlining, which I mentioned with the discovery writing, where you do your first draft in the discovery style and then you might review it later and retroactively apply some sort of outline to it. Two really famous outliners slash planners that I came across are James Patterson and Brandon Sanderson. So I've some quotes from them talking about their approach to writing. So James Patterson said, if you do enough planning before you start to write, there's no way you can have writer's block, which is what a lot of people who use the outlining method seem to be saying. He also said to always stay open and try out things in your outline. Keep thinking the unthinkable. So, going back to that topic of flexibility with your outline. Don't be too rigid with it. Don't be too structured with it. Stay flexible with it. And then Brandon Sanderson said, I'm a writer who works from an outline. What I generally do when I build an outline is I find focal important scenes and I build them in my head. And I don't write them yet, but I build toward them. Which is definitely part of his teaching that I've taken on board myself while outlining my novel. So let's talk about me. It's my YouTube channel, it's my video. Let's all talk about me. No, I'm joking, but I will talk about what's been working well for me. And honestly, it's been a mix of both. It's been doing my outline, keeping it a bit vague, a bit generic, and but also listing off my key scenes. So in my story, I have a number of things that I absolutely want to happen that I feel are going to be crucial to the story. Some of those things are really big events that might need a couple of chapters to lead up to, that might take place over a few chapters and maybe have a few chapters afterwards to wind down from. And some of them are just a simple conversation or even just a sentence, something that somebody says. Like something that kind of triggered my writing session today was just popping into my head the sentence, I'm leaving tomorrow while I have the chance. And it's not a very profound sentence. It's not very unique or creative, but it was enough to help me write the scene. It was enough to trigger me sitting down and actually just writing out the scene in which that conversation takes place. And then that conversation is leading up to a bigger event. I really, really love the Kisho Tenketsu method. I will definitely do an in-depth video on that, but the very quick run through is you start off with your introduction, which is the first 10% of the book. And then you have your sort of descriptive part where you're expanding on what you introduce at the beginning. So you get to know the characters better, you get to know the world a bit better. Then you have your twist, which is an event that is quite different to what's been happening up to now, and it throws a bit of a curveball at the reader. And then at the end, you have your conclusion, which links your twist with all of the previous parts of your story together. And that has been working really, really well for me. It's the kind of structure that seems to be lining up with this particular story really well. I don't know if I would use it every time I write a story, but I definitely know for this particular story, it's working really, really well. It's really lining up nicely. The way I've been writing is basically getting my book and writing what part of the structure I'm at the top. Oh no, sorry. First I got my my post-its and I just did a brain dump of every scene, every piece of dialogue, every moment that I could currently think of that I wanted to include in the story. And then I got my outline and I rearranged those scenes in the order that I think would work best. And what did I do next? Oh yeah, I didn't go into a ton of detail. Sometimes it's one post-it is enough for one chapter. Sometimes I might need a couple of post-its for one chapter. And then once I have all the ideas down, I'm just planning how I want the sequence of events to occur. So I don't want to go into too much detail now, but I will go into a more detailed video later on where I talk about my novel or my outlining process. But yeah, essentially I'm doing a really rough outline using the Kisho Tenketsu method, and from that outline I'm doing a bit of discovery writing in the gaps between my definitive scenes and my definitive points, which is working really well. Honestly, I cannot remember the last time I've written this much. I'm on a couple of thousand words at the moment. I think I'm on like 5,000 words, which doesn't sound like a lot, but to me it feels like a lot. So we'll keep going with that and we'll see what happens. So that's all I have today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found something that you could take away from it. And I really hope that you will follow along and see how I get on this journey. As I said, I don't know anything about writing from an academic or studious or even an experience standpoint. I'm just learning this as I go. I'm researching, I'm trying and failing again and again and again and again. But I found something that's working for me, so I thought I would document it and share it with you in case it helps you as well. So, yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great week. I'll see you again soon.